The grandest Viking ship ever found was not built for a king. It lay hidden under earth for more than 1,000 years, its carved dragon head blackened by time, its planks cradling not a warrior but a woman. When archaeologists pried open the Oseberg burial in 1904, they revealed a scene so deliberate and strange that it still refuses a single story: a richly furnished ship, a wagon, exquisite textiles, and 2 women, one older, surrounded by symbols of household and status, the other younger, whose bones and chemistry trace a life that began far from the fjord. That ship holds the central paradox we will follow. Viking womanhood was neither a single banner of power nor a blanket of victimhood. It was a braided reality of authority, mobility, ritual importance, and also exposure to slavery, violence, and erasure. To understand what these burials hide, we have to begin by setting the stage. The era we call the Viking Age stretches roughly from the late 8th century into the 11th, an age defined less by uniformity than by movement. Ships were the technology that rewrote life in Northern Europe. They carried raiding parties and traders. They linked farmsteads to distant markets, and they were powerful symbols in burial. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, anchors many of these sites to precise years. So when we say a ship was buried in the early 9th century, we are not guessing. The wood tells us. Osteology and isotopes tell the bones' stories. How old a person was, what they ate, whether they grew up somewhere with different geology. DNA adds another layer. Ancestry, possible migration paths, and in some cases, surprising foreign connections. Put together, these methods give us access to lives the written sources either ignored or reshaped many centuries later. Oseberg is the place to begin because it is deceptively familiar. We have seen reconstructions in museums and on screens, the long, elegantly curved hull carved with interlaced animals, the richly patterned textiles, the delicate silver, the sledges and carts. Yet the most remarkable fact is simple and often overlooked. The principal interments were women. Archaeologists found 2 skinned and wrapped bodies inside the ship chamber. Osteological analysis estimated one woman to be middle-aged to elderly, someone likely in her 50s or older by the standards of the time, while the other was younger. The older woman was surrounded by objects that suggested wealth and status: a decorated wagon, elaborate textile work, and items associated with household authority. These are the kinds of grave goods that echo social roles beyond domesticity, markers of a household head, perhaps someone who managed land and dependence. The younger woman's presence complicates any tidy reading. For decades, she was called a handmaiden or servant in museum labels. More recent scientific techniques push that interpretation into sharper, though still tentative, focus. DNA and isotopic studies indicate that her genetic and chemical signatures differ from the older woman's and from local baseline populations. In other words, her origins may lie far from the fjords where she was buried. Some analyses suggest eastern connections, regions beyond the Baltic, perhaps as far as the Pontic-Caspian zone, though interpreting such signals requires caution. DNA can point to ancestral affinities. Isotopes indicate childhood landscapes. Neither by itself proves a life story. The younger woman may have come to Scandinavia through trade, marriage, or the far darker route of captivation and enslavement. The evidence leans toward mobility and foreign origin, but the mechanism, voluntary or coerced, remains and must remain a matter of careful inference rather than assertion. That paradox, an elite woman and a likely foreign subordinate interred together, given expensive goods and a boat meant to carry the dead into the world beyond, forces us to hold 2 images at once. On one hand, the burial underlines an elite female presence in the highest visual vocabulary of Viking power. Ship burials have a rhetoric. Ships are mobility, reach, and ritual weight. To bury a woman in a ship asserts her as someone worthy of a similar afterlife conveyance as men who are shown in martial contexts. On the other hand, the younger woman's chemistry speaks of interconnected networks of movement and exchange, in which certain people could be displaced, trafficked, or otherwise rendered vulnerable. Archaeologists such as Marit Vea and others working on Scandinavian burial landscapes have long warned against generalizing from Oseberg. It is an extraordinary, possibly unique, grave, a high-status, well-preserved snapshot of certain people at a particular moment. But extraordinary does not mean irrelevant. Oseberg gives us a framework to ask sharper questions about gendered power: who could accumulate and display wealth, who controlled domestic and economic resources, and whose bodies became part of ritual expression. The wooden chest, the cart, the fine woolen textiles woven with patterns that would have taken months to produce, these are not anonymous items. They signal labor, control of production, and the transfer of wealth and prestige across generations. If we widen our gaze to other boat graves from the earlier Vendel period and into the Viking Age proper, a pattern of continuity and of variety emerges. In eastern Sweden, Vendel-era burials predate the classic Viking raids and yet already display elite image-making through weaponry and boats. In some of these graves, women are accompanied by ornate brooches, necklaces of glass and amber, and objects with zoomorphic decoration that resonate with the later Viking aesthetic. Brooches, in particular, are a recurring signifier in female burials. Paired brooches at the shoulders are a common marker of women in graves across Scandinavia, and the quality and material of those brooches often map onto social standing. Gold and silver, elaborate filigree, and imported materials indicate participation in long-distance trade networks. They do not, on their own, tell us how many women were elite, but they do tell us that women were visible markers of status in the mortuary landscape. Runestones and rune inscriptions complicate the picture further. Many runic monuments commemorate men, but a significant minority are raised by or for women, and some explicitly mention property, kinship, and the roles women played in household management. The runic record is a textual echo to the physical goods. Women could own or administer property. They could be named as central figures in family memory. Legal codes and saga material written down later reflect such rights in varying detail. References to keys as a symbol of a woman's household authority, to women acting as oath-keepers in families, to the role of widows in managing estates. Yet here, the historian's caution must come forward. Much of the saga literature was written down after Christianization and often reflects ideals and anxieties filtered through monastic pens. Sagas and chronicles can illuminate cultural memory, but they are not a substitute for bones and timber. When we invoke sagas, we flag them as later voices that must be read against the tangible remains. Material culture provides additional texture. The presence of keys in graves is one of those small material signals that carries outsized meaning. Keys and their associated fittings have been interpreted as signs of domestic managerial responsibility. Where they appear alongside rich dress and imported goods, they reinforce a reading of women as household heads or stewards of family wealth. At the same time, jewelry and textiles gesture toward female labor and networks of production. Textile work itself was highly valued, both economically and symbolically. Women's work in spinning and weaving was a source of wealth. Clothes and tapestries were portable assets and could be given or pledged in legal arrangements. That economic agency, present in many grave assemblages, argues against a flatline picture of subordination. But archaeology also shows a more precarious side of life for women in the Viking world. The very mobility that made commerce and cultural exchange possible also created markets in people. Slavery existed in many forms across early medieval Europe, and Viking Age societies participated in slave-taking as captors and as markets. Osteological and isotopic evidence from a range of sites demonstrates that some individuals, men, women, and children, were non-local in ways consistent with movement by coercion. Human remains found in contexts associated with ritual deposits in bogs and wetlands, as well as accounts by Christian chroniclers describing sacrifices and captivities, introduce the difficult question of ritualized violence and coerced relocation. We must be precise here. The archaeological record does not support sweeping claims that human sacrifice or systematic female enslavement was universal in Viking society. But it does supply instances, burials and deposits that require explanation, that point to a reality in which some lives were forcibly uprooted, some bodies offered or disposed of, and some women interred under circumstances that suggest diminished agency. The Sima, or Salme, ship finds off the coast of what is now Estonia provide a stark foil to the gentility of Oseberg. Discovered in the early 21st century, the Salme finds revealed ships used in conflict and burials of dozens of warriors, many with evidence of violent trauma. Osteological analysis of the bones shows blades, fractures, and perimortem injuries consistent with violent deaths. These were not ceremonial burials of an honored elite in peace. They were, by most interpretations, the result of battles at sea or violent confrontations on shore. While the Salme bodies were mainly male, the relevance to women is indirect but crucial. The loss of fighting-age men to raiding or war reshaped communities. Men gone to sea meant women remained to manage land, households, and dependents, an elevation of responsibility that could mean real authority, but also increased exposure to threat. Communities with absent warriors could find themselves vulnerable to counter-raids or political coercion. In such contexts, women's roles both rose in importance and became more fraught. One of the recurring, unsettling juxtapositions in grave contexts is the intermingling of power and subordination within single burial episodes. A woman with a chest of silver and a wagon might be buried alongside a younger woman who shows isotopic signs of foreign origin, possibly indicating forced migration. The proximity of luxury and servitude in death reflects a living social order where household wealth and personal vulnerability were inseparable facets of the same economy. This is where the title's assertion, that Viking women endured things they tried to hide, finds its most literal expression. The burial chamber is a palimpsest of public claim and private cost. Religious life adds another complicated layer. Archaeological traces and literary echoes suggest that certain women held ritual power. The vulva, a seeress figure found across poetic and saga literature, occupies a liminal place in our sources. Powerful, feared, consulted in matters of fate. Material correlates of cider or ritual practice are more elusive. Items such as staffs, special combs, or objects associated with ritual specialists have been proposed as evidence for female ritual practitioners. But the link between material culture and the image of the vulva remains interpretive rather than definitive. Nevertheless, when combined with textual echoes, often dated later but possibly preserving older traditions, the possibility of female ritual authority is credible. Women could be ritual specialists, political brokers, and legal actors, sometimes simultaneously. That capacity for public religious and political action sat alongside private vulnerabilities. A woman who could pronounce fate might still be subject to sale, marriage bargains, or the caprices of a violent society. We should not ignore the voices that tell a different later story. Christian chroniclers of the 10th and 11th centuries, writing with missionary and moral agendas, painted Scandinavia as a landscape of pagan excess and bloody rites. Saga authors, writing even later, dramatized strong, sometimes heroic women, shield maidens, steerswomen, and avenging widows. But these literary figures are framed by narrative needs and cultural memory, rather than by systematic empirical record. The danger is twofold: to accept the sagas as direct reportage of everyday life, or to dismiss them entirely. The right approach is triangulation. We let wood, bone, and metal speak first. We treat later written testimonies as reflections of memory and ideology that can illuminate but not dictate interpretation. Science helps to disentangle these threads. Strontium isotope analysis, applied to dental enamel, can reveal whether a person grew up in the local geological environment or somewhere different. When a tooth's strontium signature diverges from local baseline values, we have a formal reason to consider migration. DNA analysis, now standard in many archaeological projects, can identify genetic affinities pointing east or south of the Baltic. Dendrochronology anchors the trees used in shipbuilding to precise years, sometimes even seasons, giving an exactness to the archaeological chronology that allows us to connect burials across space and time. Taken together, these methods do not reconstruct full biographies, but they dramatically narrow the range of plausible life histories. They force us to confront the fact that mobility in the Viking Age included traders, migrants, marital exchange, and people taken against their will. And yet, archaeology is always a conversation between what is preserved and what is not. Organic materials decay. Textiles, ropes, and leather survive only in special conditions. Much of women's work, spinning, household management, the daily maintenance of a farm, leaves few bones or metal traces and thus risks invisibility in an archive biased toward durable things. That invisibility is itself a form of erasure, one that the discipline is now trying to correct through careful attention to small finds, soil chemistry, and contextual reading of sites. Returning to Oseberg, consider the textiles found in the grave. Richly woven, layered garments whose patterns and colors would have been marked signs of identity and life. Textile production was not merely domestic drudgery, it was an economy and a craft whose outputs were portable wealth. The garments, the tent-like curtains within the ship, the decorated chests. These are things that tell us a woman's life involved command of skilled labor and exchange. Yet layered into those same vestments is the presence of someone whose life story begins far beyond the shipyard. The younger woman's bones, her chemical signals, her absence of local isotopic markers. The Oseberg burial thus stages a social performance. It broadcasts a household's wealth and social network while simultaneously concealing difficult questions about how that household's labor was arranged and at whose expense. Few single sites sum up the tensions of Viking womanhood the way Oseberg does. But other graves, other finds, show different facets. The Vendel burial's ornamental cloaks and brooches, runestones that memorialize women as benefactors, legal fragments that hint at women's rights to property and to speak at assemblies, and the grim, clustered remains from battlefield contexts, like Salme. Each piece adds to the mosaic. A woman in a wealthy grave may have been literate in the law of her kin, may have given gifts to seal alliances, may have been a memory holder whose family identity was anchored in her burial. Another woman, found in a bog deposit or lacking local isotopic signatures, may have been a captive whose voice did not survive in stone or runic text. This tension, agency, and vulnerability entwined, runs like a seam through the archaeology. It resists the tidy narratives we prefer, the lone shield maiden, the independent farm mistress, or the helpless captive. It insists instead on complexity. When we look into graves, we see gestures of power, boats, wagons, ornaments, inscriptions. When we read bones and their chemical signatures, we sometimes see pathways of displacement and difference. Each dataset asks questions of the others. Why is this woman buried with such wealth? Where did that other woman grow up? Did the presence of a foreign-born woman in an elite grave represent alliance through marriage, adoption into a household, or coerced servitude? The evidence guides us to plausible answers, but rarely to the final word. If this fascinates you, hit subscribe to follow our archaeology deep dives. With that context established, we can begin to map the broader topography of female lives in Viking Age Scandinavia. The Vendel to Viking continuum offers one set of coordinates, long-term elite practices that included female display and investment in prestige goods. The runic and legal fragments offer political and economic glimpses, women as property holders, as actors in family memory, as possibly empowered in ways that were legal as well as social. But parallel to these continuities are disruptions. Increasing long-distance raiding and trade created markets and captives and slaves. The growth of centralized power in some regions created new pressures on small communities. The archaeological record is not a tidy ladder, but a braided river. We can follow one thread into detail. In upland and nearby regions, graves from the late Iron Age and Vendel periods contain female interments that are clearly marked by high-status goods. The richness of the metalwork, gold collars, gilt bronze brooches, glass and amber beads, signals connections to exchange networks extending into the Baltic and beyond. The patterns of animal ornamentation on metalwork and wood resonate across the North Sea and into the continental Germanic world, indicating shared aesthetic languages that elite women participated in as consumers and, likely, as patrons of craft. Some of these finds predate the classic Viking raids, yet foreshadow a social environment that would soon be punctuated by far-reaching maritime activity. At the same time, Late Iron Age graves sometimes include female burials with items interpreted as ritual paraphernalia, staffs, amulets, and exotic objects that may mark religious function. These are tantalizing because they connect material signs to the literary image of the vulva, a woman who stands at the boundary between communal life and sacred expertise. The archaeological evidence here is fragmentary. The reading from object to role remains cautious. Nonetheless, the coexistence in the funerary record of elite display and possible ritual paraphernalia reinforces the sense that women occupied multifarious public roles, political, economic, and sacred. There is also a legal dimension that the material record supports indirectly. Keys and domestic accoutrements in graves, the occurrence of women as named persons on stones, and the way wealth is visibly deposited in female burials all lend weight to documentary evidence that women could exercise control over property. In some cases, widowhood appears to have translated into expanded authority, an institutional space where women could become central figures in their household's fortunes. Again, the archaeological language is careful. These are signs, not incontrovertible proof. But when multiple lines of evidence point in the same direction, we can say with reasonable confidence that women could be, and sometimes were, major economic actors. Yet economic agency coexisted with exposure to violence. The Salome ships put that bluntly before us. They show that martial conflict was not an abstract backdrop, but an immediate force that claimed bodies. Such losses ripple outward. Farmsteads without able-bodied defenders were more likely to be plundered or coerced. Communities with fewer men might have to rely on negotiated settlements that placed women in precarious positions. These are the structural conditions that can explain why foreign-origin women show up in elite graves. They may have been brides in alliance-building marriages that linked families across distances. They may have been captives integrated into households, or they may have been migrants seeking new lives in a world of expanding trade. Each scenario is plausible within the archaeological and historical frameworks. The evidence sometimes favors one over another, but rarely does it give exclusive certainty. At the heart of our inquiry is a methodological humility. Archaeology gives us strong tools: dendrochronology for dates, isotopes and DNA for origins, osteology for age and health. But every method has limits. Sample sizes can be small, preservation is uneven. Later medieval texts must be used with care. When we say that a woman's DNA suggests Eastern ancestry, we provide the method and the interpretive boundary. It may indicate migration, intermarriage, or an ancestor from that region. When an older burial displays a cart and textiles worthy of a queen's retinue, we note the implication for status while refusing to transform a grave assemblage into a full biography without corroborating lines of evidence. This cautious but insistent approach is how we begin to lift the lid on the secrets that the title promises. Not secrets of conspiracies or tidy moral tales, but the hidden complexities of everyday lives. The Oseberg woman's burial tells us that some women commanded remarkable wealth and ritual honor. The younger woman in the same chamber tells us that networks of exchange included human lives that moved, willingly, unwillingly, or somewhere between, from one region to another. The Vendel graves and runestones tell us that status and legal presence for women were not anomalies, but part of a broader social grammar. The Psalm ships remind us that violence shaped the conditions under which women exercised authority. Stones, bones, wood, and metal together give us a polyphonic record, voices of power and vulnerability woven into one funerary stitch. We are left, then, with difficult questions about visibility and erasure. Which women made it into memorial stones and richly furnished graves? Which remain absent from the record because their material culture did not survive? How do later literary memories amplify certain female types while silencing others? Answering these questions requires us to keep expanding the data set. More isotopic surveys of female remains, broader DNA sampling with careful comparative baselines, a renewed emphasis on small finds and textile analysis, and an attention to the places where women's daily work would have left subtle traces in the soil. As we prepare to move from the quieter signals of status and mobility to the darker evidence of coercion and ritual violence, it is important to hold these tensions in mind. The ship, the wagon, the keys, the brooches, These speak to a life in which agency and authority existed in tangible ways. The isotopes, the genetic signs of distant origins, and the clustered remains from battle sites speak to a landscape of exposure and danger. Putting those narratives together does not resolve the contradictions. It preserves them, which is the only honest way to represent lives lived at the margins of preservation and memory. The next step is to examine in closer detail the evidence for slavery, captive-taking, and possible ritualized killings, how bog deposits and sacrificial contexts have been interpreted, what the limits of those interpretations are, and what the living conditions may have been for women who found themselves on the wrong side of power. Those questions bring us face to face with the practical realities of Viking mobility. What happened to communities when men left for long expeditions? How did households reorganize? And in what ways did the wider economy commodify human lives? We turn now to that fraught territory, attentive to the difference between what the bones can tell us and what the soil cannot. We press into the evidence where material traces turn from signs of status to signs of constraint, where isotopes, DNA, and the contexts of deposition begin to sketch lives that may have been coerced, traded, or sacrificed. The question is uncomfortable because it forces us to imagine possibilities that the grave itself does not name. Still, there are patterns that demand attention: human movement visible in tooth enamel, genetic affinities that do not match local populations, clustered deposits in wetlands, and later narratives that, while biased, corroborate the existence of human commodification in Northern Europe. The simplest starting point is the archaeologically visible fact of non-local origin. When a woman's dental enamel carries strontium values inconsistent with the bedrock around a Scandinavian cemetery, we can say with confidence that she spent her childhood somewhere else. DNA data that aligns an individual with genetic markers more common to regions east of the Baltic strengthens that observation. In isolation, these lines tell us movement. Combined with the social context, an interment that places her in a subordinate position relative to the main interment, they create a plausible narrative. She was not born into that household. The how remains open: marriage alliance, voluntary migration for opportunities, or forced transfer as captive or slave. We must keep all three paths in our interpretive toolkit. Archaeology alone rarely hands us an explicit enslavement tag. There are no identity bracelets or seller's invoices in the ground. Instead, signs of bondage must be inferred from wider proof: demographic patterns in cemeteries, burial contexts where certain individuals are repeatedly found in subordinate positions, and literary sources that document a market for people. Contemporary external witnesses reinforce this picture. Arabic traders and chroniclers, Byzantine officials, and later Christian clerics all record that people from the north were involved in the slave trade, both as captors and as participants in wider exchange networks that trafficked human beings to southern and eastern markets. One of the most evocative textual accounts comes from a 10th century envoy, who described a Rus funeral in which a female attendant was sacrificed to accompany the deceased leader. That narrative sits uneasily against the archaeological record. It is vivid but singular, colored by outsider perspective. Still, when that kind of text is read alongside physical cases of non-local women in subordinate burial positions, the pieces cohere into a plausible social reality in which vulnerable people could be uprooted and transported across great distances. We also confront contexts of deliberate deposition: wetlands, bogs, springs. Northern Europe preserves an unusual archive in peat and marshy terrain where organic matter survives. From those wetlands come bodies deposited with care or violence, and weapons and objects deliberately placed in the murk. Some deposits are clearly votive: weapons from defeated foes, animal remains, richly worked objects offered in what archaeologists interpret as acts of consecration. Other deposits include human remains, sometimes with telltale signs, binding, strangulation marks, or blunt force trauma, and sometimes in a state that makes interpretation difficult. Scholars debate whether such deposits represent punishment, homicide, judicial execution, or ritual killing. Many finds predate the Viking Age, but continuity in the practice of wet deposition into the early medieval period is attested at several sites. The interpretive caution is vital. The presence of a body in a bog cannot be automatically labeled sacrifice. At the same time, when a pattern emerges, repeated human deposits at a site, contextualized by offerings and selective treatment of the body, we must entertain ritualized violence as a credible explanation. One of the most contested arenas in recent scholarship revolves around the so-called sacrifice narratives and how they intersect with archaeological depositions. Christian chroniclers, writing from the vantage point of conversion campaigns, had rhetorical reasons to emphasize pagan brutality. Their accounts portray ritual killings and elaborate sacrificial rites as evidence of spiritual otherness that required Christian correction. Archaeology both confirms and complicates those images. Yes, there are isolated instances where the burial context is highly suggestive of ritual killing. But the practice does not map evenly across the Scandinavian world, and the archaeological frequency is far too low to justify claims of routine, institutionalized human sacrifice. The more defensible conclusion is that ritualized killing occurred in some places at some times, and that the archaeological and textual records together create a patchy but real picture of occasional localized practices that could include the offering of human life. Beyond wetland contexts, there is the legal and economic infrastructure that made people into commodities. Law codes and saga narratives picture thralls as part of the household economy, people who worked, who could be bought or sold, and whose offspring could be born into bondage. The material trace of slavery is indirect, changes in diet evident in bone chemistry, isotopic signatures showing non-local origins among certain cohorts, and demographic anomalies in mortuary assemblages. Taken together with documentary records of markets and ransom practices, the pattern is hard to ignore. Slavery was an entrenched, if regionally variable, feature of early medieval northern economies. For women specifically, the stakes were different because gender shaped how enslaved people were used and positioned. Female captives could be integrated as domestic labor, brides in alliance-making marriages, sexual partners, or exchanged in diplomatic settlements. Grave contexts, like Oseberg, where an elite woman is accompanied by a younger non-local female, dramatize precisely these entanglements of status and servitude. The human consequences were real. Mobility that empowered some could create vulnerability for others. When raiding parties departed, they did not simply carry loot. They carried people. The market for captives linked Scandinavian communities to markets as far-flung as Constantinople and the Islamic caliphates. The archaeological traces of that trade include imported goods in cemeteries, foreign coinage circulating in hoards, and genetic fingerprints of long-distance contact. For women who entered these circuits involuntarily, daily life could mean a negotiation of survival inside a household that exploited their labor while claiming kinship continuity through marriage exchanges or adoption. The burial record can sometimes show a later investiture, dress, jewelry, a respected interment, that suggests incorporation into the household. Whether that incorporation indicates genuine acceptance or coerced assimilation is often impossible to determine. Still, the co-presence of elite goods and transplanted bodies in graves forces us to confront the moral contradictions of a society that valorized both hospitality and human appropriation. War and violence compound these contradictions. The Salme finds and similar battlefield deposits make vivid the immediate dangers of martial life and the demographic consequences for communities. But violence is not only battlefield death. It is also interpersonal coercion, raid-induced displacement, and punitive acts that left bodies in places they would not have occupied in ordinary life. Burial choices, who is included, who is excluded, how bodies are treated, are political statements. When communities bury an elite woman in a ship and include a younger, non-local woman in the chamber, they are not only making a statement about power, they are graving into the earth the household relationships as they wish them to be remembered. Sometimes those relationships reflected dignity. Sometimes they masked exploitation. We turn now to the religious sphere, where the dualities of female experience find particularly striking expression. The materials associated with cedar and with ritual specialists are not abundant, but the combination of material hints and literary echoes suggests the genuine existence of female ritual authority. The vulva, as she appears in later poetry and saga, is a liminal figure who moves between private and public, between the domestic sphere and the sacred. Archaeological candidates for ritual paraphernalia, specialized staffs, unique dress elements, or grave assemblages that deviate from normative domestic gear, have been proposed as markers of ritual function. Those proposals are interpretive, but they fit into a broader pattern. Women could and did occupy roles as mediators of fate, as charismatic law-sayers, and as ritual specialists consulted in moments of family or communal crisis. This ritual authority carried with it social capital that could translate into political influence. The imagery on runestones and references in later law codes indicate that women sometimes had recognizable legal standing. Keys and chest fittings in graves read as emblems of household management. Names recorded on stones show women as beneficiaries and benefactors in memorial culture. In legal settings, women could be oath helpers, witnesses, and sometimes decision-makers. That is the empowering side of the coin, ritual and legal authority that made women central to the reproduction of social order. The other side, as we have already stressed, included vulnerability to the market, to violence, and to diminishing memory when material traces decayed. The saga literature offers colorful examples, shield maidens, prophetesses, and powerful matriarchs. But we must approach these texts with methodical caution. Most sagas were written down centuries after the events they describe, and are saturated with the literary concerns of their authors. They amplify social types, sharpen moral contrasts, and sometimes project later medieval norms back onto the past. Yet the stories preserve elements of a cultural memory that sometimes align with archaeological patterns. Female ritual experts, women who control household wealth, and narratives of abduction and exchange. When these literary echoes intersect with physical evidence, grave goods suggesting ritual function, runic inscriptions that acknowledge women's roles, the combined testimony becomes stronger than either source standing alone. Our scientific tools have, in recent decades, become sophisticated enough to open new windows on these lives. Strontium isotopes, oxygen isotopes, and ancient DNA allow us to ask questions that would have been impossible even a generation ago. When enamel shows a childhood signal from a different geological region, and genetic data points to ancestry in distant lands, a narrative of movement becomes far more plausible than it once was. Dendrochronology anchors the crafts and the ships to narrow chronological windows, letting us see how particular social forms coincide with certain decades. Osteological studies read health and trauma into bones, markers of nutrition, signs of healed injury, and evidence of violent death. Each dataset arrives with caveats. Isotopic baselines can be patchy. Genetic affiliations do not equal precise geographic provenance. Osteological signatures are partial. Yet together they create a multidimensional portrait that single-method approaches cannot match. There is a methodological humility embedded in this approach, and it is essential to our conclusions. We do not, and must not, tell a single tale about Viking women. The archaeological record refuses it. Instead, we are left with a braided story. Women who wielded property and ritual power. Women who ran estates while warriors were away. Women who knitted social alliances through weaving and gift-giving. And women who could be uprooted, trafficked, or violently killed. The shocking element the title promises is not a lurid revelation of universal cruelty, but the upsetting juxtaposition of power and dispossession in the same scenes. The Oseberg chamber epitomizes that unease, opulent wealth and intimate authority set beside evidence of displacement and subordination. If we pause to consider the social mechanics behind such juxtaposition, a few dynamics stand out. First, mobility was both opportunity and threat. The same ship technology that allowed a woman to oversee far-flung trade networks or to send gifts across the Baltic also enabled raiders to seize captives and transport them to markets. Second, household economy centralized certain forms of power in women, textile production, dowry management, and stewardship, yet that power rested on social conditions that could be precarious. The absence of men, shifting political allegiances, and economic fluctuations. Third, ritual authority could legitimize female influence but not shield women from the political machinations that place them at risk: marriage negotiations, hostage exchanges, or punitive seizures. The cemetery, then, is where communities attempted to stabilize these tensions by making public claims about identity and belonging. The grave assemblage communicates values. Here is someone who commanded labor. Here is someone whose family wanted to broadcast status. Here is someone whose presence in the household will be remembered. But graves also silence. They erase quotidian labor. They hide the coercion that might have enabled display, and they substitute a memorial narrative for a complex biography. Archaeology's task is to read these silences alongside the material utterances, bones, objects, and the chemistry of teeth, and to reconstruct the most plausible life histories within the strictures of the evidence. That reconstruction also demands a regional and temporal sensitivity. What we see in central Sweden may not map onto coastal Norway or the islands of the North Atlantic. The intensity of raiding, the integration into long-distance trade, and the influence of Christianization all varied geographically and chronologically. Some communities may have practiced wetland deposition with ritual regularity. Others may have rarely done so. Some women may have held enduring legal rights. In other places, those rights may have been less visible or more contested. Archaeology, at its best, refuses universal claims and insists on contextualization. Where does that leave us in answering the puzzle posed by the title? What Viking women really endured and what was hidden? The honest response is twofold. First, they endured a world of opportunity and danger, in which authority and vulnerability were not mutually exclusive but entwined. Some women exercised significant power, control of household wealth, ritual significance, and a form of public memory recorded on stone and in richly furnished graves. Others, sometimes within the same household, lived precariously, uprooted from their childhood homes, integrated into foreign households, or subjected to markets in which human persons were objects of exchange. Second, what was hidden is not always a sinister secret, but a consequence of archaeological invisibility and later narrative shaping. The daily labors that secured wealth were ephemeral. The service rendered by many women left little trace. The voices of captives rarely made it into runic memorials. The sand and peat preserved the spectacular and the violent, but did not archive ordinary household speech. The responsibility of contemporary scholarship is to balance recognition of prestigious female roles with unflinching attention to the evidence for dispossession and violence. That is the ethical imperative, to tell neither a triumphant story nor a victim tale alone, but a layered history that honors both the labors and the losses. Practically, this means expanding data sets, more isotopic sampling across sexes and ages, wider genomic surveys calibrated to solid baselines, greater focus on small finds and textiles, and interdisciplinary engagements with legal and textual evidence that respect chronology and bias. It also requires clear public communication, because the public appetite for dramatic narratives, shield maidens, heroic matriarchs, and human sacrifices can obscure the careful, nuanced work that builds deep understanding. Closing with a human note, we return to the images that open this exploration. The dragon-headed prow, the layered garments, the pair of women in a ship. When we stand before such a reconstructed burial in a museum, it is easy to be seduced by aesthetics and to imagine a tidy moral. But the closer we look, the more we let the bone chemistry and the wood rings and the runic stones speak, the more complex the picture becomes. The woman who commanded a household and was carried to her final rest in a ship was not a symbol alone. She was a person made of choices, obligations, responsibilities, and constraints. The younger woman at her side was also a person whose life narrative stretched beyond the fjord, whose presence in the chamber presses us to ask uncomfortable questions about power, exchange, and coercion. If the shocking secret is anything, it is this: Viking womanhood cannot be reduced to a single identity. It is instead a spectrum in which authority, spirituality, economic worth, and bodily vulnerability intersect in unpredictable ways. Archaeology gives us the instruments to see that spectrum, but it also insists on humility in interpretation. To honor the dead is to tell their story with restraint and care, recognizing both the grandeur of some burials and the marginalization of others. For those who want to go deeper into these themes, into the science that reads teeth and timber, into the case studies of particular boat graves, and into the contested debates about ritual deposition, there is more to explore. Watch our follow-up deep dive on Viking ritual practice and the scientific methods transforming medieval archaeology, or follow the playlist where we examine individual sites and the experts who study them. Subscribe, and help us keep bringing evidence-driven narratives that complicate the myths we inherit.